I'm Kasem. Well, we have two debuts this week, and rolling in at number 33, here's our first debut. It's by Duncan Sheik, a 26-year-old singer-songwriter who likes to record songs that are challenging to the listener. He says, quote, I want to combine an adventurous sonic palette with songs that people can sink their teeth into. Well, here's a tasty treat Duncan Sheik wrote called Barely Breathing.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm David Perry for Casey Kasem. And sliding a notch to number 34 on Casey's Top 40 is Duncan Sheik, a recent graduate of Brown University in Rhode Island. He majored in semiotics, the study of modern culture and media. But along with earning a college degree, Duncan also managed to get a recording contract. And now he has his very first hit. Here's Barely Breathing by Duncan Sheik.
I know what you're doing. Casey's Coast to Coast.
Well, now we're up to Duncan Sheik, a newcomer who found his place in music with the help of two college classmates, singer Lisa Loeb and the daughter of a Motown superstar. Duncan grew up in New Jersey, where he learned to play piano and guitar at a very young age. By the time he reached high school, Duncan was already writing songs and playing in bands. And in 1988, when he enrolled at Brown University in Rhode Island, Duncan continued to play. One of his classmates was a singer named Lisa Loeb. She hired Duncan to play lead guitar in her band and toured up and down the East Coast. He performed with her before she went on to national fame a few years later with her #1 hit, Stay, I Miss You. After Duncan graduated from Brown in 1992, he moved to L.A. There he contacted another of his college classmates, a woman named Tracy Ross. He gave her a copy of his demo tape and said, hey, do you know anyone who can help me get a contract? Well, Tracy said, sure, my mom. And she passed the tape along to her mother, Motown legend Diana Ross. With Diana's help, Duncan Sheik signed to a small label called Immortal Records. Last year, he signed a new contract with Atlantic Records. And now, thanks to the help of his two former college classmates and a lot of hard work on his own, this 27-year-old singer has his very first hit. It's the song that climbs 4 notches to number 30 this week on Casey's Top 40. We're counting down now to Duncan Sheik, a musician who went to a Buddhist meeting for spiritual enlightenment and wound up finding musical enlightenment as well. Details coming up.
Casey counts them down. Casey's Top 40.
Well, now we're up to the first hit for Duncan Sheik, a musician who went to a Buddhist meeting for spiritual enlightenment and wound up finding musical enlightenment as well. Here's the story. For his debut album, Duncan hooked up with a famous British record producer, Rupert Hine, a music business veteran who'd worked with some of the biggest stars from England. To help his new client better understand his style, Rupert suggested Duncan get together with Howard Jones, who you may remember with such big hits from the 80s as Things Can Only Get Better and No One Is to Blame. The problem was Duncan was leaving the next day, so there was no way he could get together with Howard Jones. But then fate stepped in. That night, Duncan Sheik, who's a practicing Buddhist, went to a Buddhist meeting in London. He says he went there to find some peace and solace and to work on his spiritual side. But as it worked out, his musical side got some assistance as well. Who should be sitting there but Howard Jones, who it turned out is also a practicing Buddhist. Duncan introduced himself, and after the meeting, the two men got together to discuss the many things they shared in common. They began with Buddhism, but it didn't take long before Howard Jones was enlightening Duncan Sheik on the fine art of making his music move from the spiritual realm to the physical one. Duncan says, quote, it was totally random. It was really cool. A coincidental chance meeting. This week, a song that came out of that chance meeting between Howard Jones and Duncan Sheik climbs a notch to number 29 on Casey's Top 40.
Casey's Coast to Coast.
And rising 2 notches to 18 on Casey's Top 40 is a newcomer who posed for a fashion layout in Sassy magazine last summer. The teen magazine dubbed him the next big thing and described his fashion style as, quote, way chic. Here's Duncan Sheik.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm Casey Kasem. Well, now we're up to Barely Breathing. It's by a musician who at the age of 12 joined a heavy metal cover band, a band he said was horrible. Growing up in South Carolina, Duncan Sheik spent several years going to music camp where he learned to play both classical and jazz on the piano and guitar. And at the age of 12, he got a chance to put his musical skills to the test when he joined his first band. They were called Slightly Off. And Duncan says that's just about what they were, slightly off. Unlike other heavy metal bands at the time who wore leopard prints and spandex, 12-year-old Duncan says he wore, quote, really tight powder blue corduroys, a white shirt, and a skinny red tie, unquote. He says, I was like this novelty kid in a band with a bunch of high school guys. We played mostly cover versions of songs, covers of hits by Van Halen and Def Leppard, and he describes the music his band played as horrible. Well, these days, Duncan's music and clothes have changed for the better. His debut single entered the survey 5 weeks ago, and this week climbs 2 notches to number 13.
Number 15.
Dropping 2 notches is a singer born in New Jersey, raised in South Carolina, and who attended prep school in Massachusetts. This is Duncan Sheik with Barely Breathing.
Casey counts them down. Casey's Top 40.
I'm Kasem. These are the week's biggest hits from 40 to number 1, and we're counting them down. Holding steady at number 10 is Duncan Sheik with a very personal account of a painful breakup. Here's Barely Breathing.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm Kasem. Well, now we're up to the first hit for a singer and songwriter who says his biggest musical inspiration wasn't another musician. It was an elderly woman who always told him that his music was amazing. Since Duncan Sheik released his self-titled debut album last year, critics have had a field day finding elements in his music of jazz, blues, alternative, new wave, new age, you name it. Critics have found it. Journalists have suggested all sorts of inspirations for Duncan's music, but Duncan says the biggest inspiration of them all is one that none of them have guessed. Duncan says that growing up, the person who influenced him the most was his mother's mother, his maternal grandmother. Duncan was very young when his parents were divorced. He left his home in New Jersey to live in South Carolina with his mother and her mother. Duncan says he was a shy, lonely child who at 4 years old would try and play the piano. He says, quote, I would sit down at the piano and improvise musical nonsense. But to his grandmother it wasn't nonsense. It was heavenly music made by her beloved grandson, and she'd always tell him it was, quote, amazing. Inspired by his grandmother, Duncan worked hard to live up to her description, and by the time he was in college, he was a professional musician. And this week, Duncan Sheik climbs a notch to number 9 on Casey's Top 40 with his first Top 40 hit.
Casey's Top 40.
Sitting in for Casey Kasem, I'm David Perry. And rising back up a notch to number 22 on Casey's Top 40 is a singer-songwriter who's been spending the summer as a special guest on Sean Colvin's tour. This is Duncan Sheik with Barely Breathing.
Well, I know what you're doing. I see it all too clear. 'Cause I am barely breathing, and I can't find the air. I don't suppose it's worth the price, the price that I wouldn't pay. Casey